Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At Sunday lunch, while Emily stood at the head of the table, pouring sweet tea like she was hosting the damn Emmys, Mom leaned in close with that soft, saccharine voice of hers, the one she always used when delivering a compliment that cut like a blade wrapped in satin, and said, "We just wish you were more like her." I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I didn't even look at her. I just nodded slightly, as if she'd commented on the weather, then shifted my gaze back to the glistening glazed ham in the center of the table. I helped clear the plates, smiled when appropriate, offered to bring out the pie like the polite, disappointing daughter I'd trained myself to be. Then, with the kind of practiced grace that only years of emotional restraint could teach, I left without a single goodbye. I didn't turn on the radio during the drive back to my Airbnb. I didn't answer my sister's text asking if I'd made it back safely. I didn't reply to Dad's half-hearted "thanks for coming" message sent 2 hours too late. By the time I closed the door behind me and let the silence of the rented room settle around my shoulders like an old quilt, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to cry, and I sure as hell wasn't going to explain myself. Because this wasn't the first time they'd tried to carve me down to size with a whisper, and it wasn't the first time they thought I'd take it on the chin and move on like I always did. But this time, something felt different. Not louder. Just colder. The thing about growing up as the other daughter is that eventually you learn to translate every look, every word, every goddamn sigh. You start to hear the things they don't say even louder than the ones they do. Emily could forget birthdays, lose jobs, cry in the middle of dinner over nothing, and still, somehow, be the pride of the family. Meanwhile, I could land promotions, send thoughtful gifts, even pay for their damn anniversary cruise one year, and I'd still be introduced as our oldest instead of by name. Like I was some decorative extra, the plain one they didn't know what to do with but couldn't quite throw away. The house hadn't changed much in the 10 months since I'd last been there. Same off-white walls, same framed family photos of Emily's kids smiling through braces and church recitals. You'd never know I existed unless you looked closely at the edges, where maybe, just maybe, a kindergarten picture of me clung to the corner of a collage like a forgotten coupon. It's amazing how home can smell like nostalgia and disappointment at the same time. Lunch started as it always did, with Emily fussing over her potato salad like she'd reinvented the recipe from scratch, and Mom fussing over Emily like she'd just survived open-heart surgery instead of a PTA meeting. I smiled politely when they complimented the way Emily had decorated the table: autumn leaves, harvest-themed napkins, a centerpiece with little gourds and glitter, as if we weren't sweating in 78-degree heat, pretending October actually meant something in Georgia. I didn't offer my opinion. I didn't join in. I just sat there, listening, watching, remembering every time I had tried too hard to be noticed, only to be told I was making a scene or too intense. And then, just before dessert, as the conversation turned toward Emily's new volunteer role at church, of course it did, Mom leaned in, as though to share a tender secret, and whispered those familiar, poisonous words. "We just wish you were more like her." There was no malice in her tone. That was the cruelest part. It was delivered with a kindness so polished it sparkled. Like she thought she was offering helpful advice. Like she thought I'd take it as encouragement. Like she hadn't said the same thing in 100 different ways since I was 12. I stood up to help with dessert. I fetched the pie. I served it with practiced efficiency, cut even slices, handed out forks. I smiled when Emily offered to pray. I nodded through Dad's rambling story about a golf game I didn't ask about. And when it was all over, I stacked my plate, rinsed it in the sink, thanked Mom for lunch, and walked out without looking back. They didn't stop me. They never did. Because I'd been leaving rooms silently my whole life. Why would they notice this time? Back in the Airbnb, I opened the mini fridge, took out the bottle of white wine I'd brought from home, and poured a glass so full it nearly spilled. I sat on the edge of the bed, stared at the wall for a long minute, then picked up my phone. Scrolling past missed texts, I paused at a familiar name I hadn't seen in over a year. Ben Carter. I hadn't spoken to him since our last high school reunion, where we shared 2 gin and tonics, 3 hours of sarcastic laughter, and one regrettably brief kiss behind the gym. But Ben was trustworthy. Ben was loyal. And more importantly, Ben owed me a favor. I typed, "Still got that old thing we talked about?" The three dots danced for a moment, then disappeared. A few seconds later, he replied, "It's in my glove box." "You sure?" I took a sip of wine, exhaled slowly, and typed, "I'm done being the quiet one." Then I added, "Drop it off in the mailbox tomorrow morning." Just like we planned. It's strange how one sentence, a little whisper over glazed ham and sweet tea, can unearth years of buried bruises. It wasn't the first time she'd said it. But it would be the last time I let her get away with it. Because what they didn't realize was that I didn't leave the table empty-handed. I left with every memory, every slight, every wound catalogued and filed, ready to be used. Not to scream. Not to accuse. But to finally be seen. And all it would take was one photo. One drawer. One carefully chosen silence. There's a particular kind of madness that sets in when you grow up in a house where the truth is always edited, where memory becomes a negotiation and gaslighting is wrapped in affection and framed like family values, and I suppose, somewhere along the way, I learned to smile while being slowly erased, taught to believe that my own feelings were too loud, too much, too inconvenient to be taken seriously, because in our family, if something hurt you, that was your fault for being sensitive, and if you remembered something ugly, you were bitter, and if you tried to bring it up, well then, you were just trying to ruin a perfectly good afternoon. I remember when I was 11 and Emily was 8, and we both wanted to take ballet classes at the local community center. I'd spent weeks practicing the positions from an old instructional VHS we'd borrowed from the library. Twisting my feet in our carpeted living room, trying to mimic the grace and posture, but when Mom found out there was only money for one of us to attend, she didn't hesitate for even a second before choosing Emily, citing how she just looked more like a dancer, and I remember standing there, jaw tight, trying to pretend I didn't care, trying to convince myself that maybe Emily did look more like a dancer, even if she couldn't touch her toes. Because wanting something in our house and not getting it meant there was something wrong with you, not the situation, not the resources, not the fairness of the decision, but you. That kind of lesson doesn't just fade with age, it festers, it calcifies, and even though I left that house at 17 and never looked back unless I absolutely had to, every visit home has always felt like peeling back a scab you know should have healed by now but still bleeds, still stings, still surprises you with how raw it is underneath. When I woke up Monday morning in that overly cheerful Airbnb bedroom, with its inspirational wall signs and lavender-scented air freshener, I didn't feel guilt or second thoughts or any of the things I'd been trained to feel when I took up space or did something deliberately. I felt sharp, focused, alert in a way I hadn't in years. Because for once I wasn't just reacting to the usual passive-aggressive parade of microcuts and comparisons. I was setting something in motion, something small but heavy, and I didn't need anyone to understand it but me. The plan wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, it was precise, delicate, surgical. I had texted Ben the night before, and I knew he wouldn't ask questions, not because he was loyal to me in any kind of romantic way, but because Ben had seen, even back in high school, what I had endured at home, the constant emotional gymnastics, the impossibility of winning a game whose rules changed daily and whose referee only wore Emily's jersey. He dropped off the envelope early, just like I asked, no note, no contact, nothing to tie it to me directly. I took the envelope from the mailbox while on my fake morning walk, tucked it into the folds of my hoodie, and slipped it into my tote bag without so much as breaking stride. Back inside the house, I moved casually, like someone who hadn't planned a single thing, like someone who had just dropped by for coffee with her aging parents and sainted little sister. Dad was already on the back porch with his usual morning paper and a lukewarm cup of black coffee that he probably didn't even taste anymore. He nodded at me, not surprised, not curious, just vaguely glad that things hadn't escalated into yelling the night before. Mom was in the kitchen, cleaning a countertop that didn't need cleaning, moving things around like the act of rearranging sugar packets could fix something intangible, like the hollowness in her voice when she asked if I'd slept okay. I nodded, told her the bed was fine, and then excused myself to the guest bathroom, the one with the seashell soap and the wicker basket full of toilet paper rolls tied with ribbons like we were in a model home, and I opened the middle drawer under the sink. The same drawer where she used to hide her cigarettes when we were kids. The drawer where I once found a torn photo of her and a man I never recognized, folded into quarters like it held something she didn't want to remember but couldn't quite throw away. That drawer had always been her quiet place, the one spot in the house that belonged to her secrets, and I knew that if I put the envelope there, she would find it, not right away, maybe not even that day, but eventually. When she reached for her tweezers or her extra toothpaste or whatever ritual item she pretended not to need anymore. The envelope wasn't big. It only held one photo, printed from an old text thread that had mysteriously found its way into my inbox years ago, one of those late-night mistakes people make when they forget that technology remembers everything. The image wasn't obscene, nothing explicit, just revealing. Emily. In a car. Leaning into someone who wasn't her husband. Hand on his cheek. Lips close enough to remove any doubt. And a timestamp in the corner that placed it smack in the middle of the family's church fundraiser 2 summers ago, the one she claimed she left early from because the baby was fussy. I never showed it to anyone before. I didn't even save it because I planned to use it. I just kept it. Like a receipt. Like a warning to myself not to buy the story being sold so loudly in our family every damn Sunday. I didn't linger in the bathroom. I didn't peek back at the drawer. I washed my hands, fixed my hair in the mirror, and returned to the kitchen just in time for Emily to walk in wearing her usual perfect mom uniform, leggings, cardigan, just enough makeup to look natural. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes, probably still stewing over my silent exit the day before, and as she reached for a coffee mug, she tilted her head and asked in that sweet, fake curious voice, "What were you smiling at in there?" I didn't miss a beat. I smiled wider, almost warmly, and said, "Just remembering something from a long time ago." Because the truth is, I wasn't angry. Not really. Anger is loud, messy, hot. What I felt was colder than that. What I felt was the heavy calm that comes after years of swallowing someone else's narrative, of being rewritten in your own life story, of nodding while being slowly erased, and once you stop trying to win their approval, once you accept that you were never supposed to win at all, the silence becomes a kind of music. And now, I'd change the key. There's a moment, early in the morning when the house is still, and the sun hasn't quite figured out whether it wants to rise or not, when the walls seem to hum with old conversations and the air feels so thick with the past that even taking a breath can drag you back decades without warning, and that's exactly the moment I imagined when I knew Mom would eventually go into that drawer, either looking for her eyebrow pencil or her breath mints, or maybe just snooping like she always did when she thought no one was watching, because that's how she functioned. Not through confrontation or demands, but through small intrusions, carefully placed sighs, and the unspoken belief that everything inside that house, including her daughter's dignity, was hers to examine, reframe, or ignore. I was already gone when it happened, already back at the little Airbnb with the fake fireplace and the awkwardly cheerful wall art that said things like live, laugh, love, as if happiness was a chore you had to tick off before lunch. And I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the first text came in from Emily, followed by a missed call, then another, and then a voicemail where her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard in years, not the kind of cracked that comes from being scolded or stressed, but the deeper, more vulnerable kind that slips out when someone's image of the world, the one they've spent their whole life carefully painting in soft, non-threatening colors, starts to crumble in the middle like a badly baked cake. The voicemail was short but frantic, and her words came out in bursts, all tangled and urgent. "Lena, I don't know what the hell is going on, but Mom's locked herself in her room, and she won't answer me, and she won't come out, and she won't stop crying. And I swear to God, if you did something, please, just tell me what's going on." I listened to it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because there was something deeply satisfying about hearing that panicked note in her voice. Something sharp and vindicating that slid into the spaces between my ribs like a warm breath in the cold. For the first time, Emily sounded like someone who didn't have control over the story, like someone who had been caught off guard, and I let it sit with me for a long while before doing anything, before even thinking about what she was asking me to do. To her credit, Emily didn't jump to accusations, not at first. She wasn't stupid, and she knew I wasn't impulsive enough to yell or throw a fit or flip a table like the families on TV who resolved everything in 30 minutes with hugs and crying in the driveway. That wasn't my style. It never had been. And if she had any sense at all, she would have known that I didn't need to do much to shake things up in that house. I just had to shift something small and let gravity do the rest. The house was already fragile, already leaning on one side, built on years of denial and favoritism and revisionist memory. I didn't knock it over. I just removed one beam. And it wasn't even a lie. The photo was real. The timestamp was real. The location was unmistakable. Emily in her silver Honda, windows fogged slightly, leaning across the center console with her hand on the cheek of a man who was very clearly not her husband of 15 years, who, as far as I knew, was still under the impression that she spent every Tuesday evening in a Bible study group instead of wrapped around someone who probably didn't even know her kids' names. I hadn't doctored it. I hadn't embellished it. I just printed it, folded it once, and placed it exactly where it would do the most damage. It was up to Mom what she chose to do with it, but judging by the reaction, she had read it for what it was, not just a betrayal of marriage vows, but a betrayal of the very myth she had so painstakingly built around her perfect daughter. Because in our family, appearances weren't just important, they were everything. You didn't just wear nice clothes and keep your lawn trimmed for the neighbors. You kept your voice down in public, you smiled at church even if your insides were boiling, you never admitted when things were falling apart, and above all, you made sure that Emily remained untouchable. That had always been the unspoken contract. Emily got the praise, the spotlight, the benefit of every doubt, and in return, she stayed on the pedestal. But pedestals are funny things, they look strong, but they're hollow as hell underneath, and all it takes is one honest truth to bring the whole thing crashing down. I didn't answer her calls, and I didn't rush back to the house to pretend I cared more than I did, because for once I didn't have to. The silence said everything. The voicemail was enough. The absence, the deliberate not showing up, that was my answer, and she knew it. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the old park near the edge of town, the one with the wooden swings and the duck pond and the walking path that used to feel enormous when we were kids, but now seemed barely large enough to get my heart rate up. I sat on one of the benches, watching a family wrangle their toddler out of a meltdown while the mom whispered threats through clenched teeth and the dad offered goldfish crackers like a peace treaty, and I thought about how no one really knows what a family looks like from the inside. From the outside, it's snapshots and posed smiles and matching sweaters at Christmas. But from the inside, it's layers of compromise, buried disappointments, and quiet wars that never get declared out loud. I must have been staring too long because my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text, not from Emily, but from Ben. Just one line, hope it helped. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. It didn't fix anything. But it tilted the mirror. Because that's what I'd done, really. I hadn't burned the house down. I hadn't screamed into the void. I hadn't tried to make anyone love me differently or finally see me for who I was. I just tilted the damn mirror so they could see themselves, see her from a new angle, one they'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start something. Or to end something. But I wasn't going to stick around to find out which. There is a particular stillness that follows a carefully planted truth, the kind of stillness that isn't really peaceful, but more like the pause right before a glass falls off a table, when everyone sees it tilting, understands what's about to happen. But no one moves fast enough to stop it, or maybe deep down, they don't want to stop it at all, because sometimes destruction is just honesty finally getting its turn to speak. That was the feeling hanging over the house the day after the drawer was opened, the envelope was found, and the myth of Emily, the golden daughter, the spiritual role model, the Mother of the Year nominee, was cracked in half like cheap porcelain. Not by accident, not by vengeance exactly, but by inevitability. I didn't go back that morning, didn't answer any of Emily's increasingly frantic texts, didn't give her the satisfaction of a voice on the other end of the line explaining what I'd done or why I had done it, because explaining would have cheapened it, would have made it sound like a stunt or a moment of spite instead of what it truly was, an overdue reckoning for a house built on performance, on curated versions of reality, on praise handed out not for who you were but for how well you could pretend to be something else entirely. And Emily, despite her theatrics and her carefully rehearsed humility, had never been as solid as she looked. She was just better at playing the part. The thing no one ever told her, though, was that playing perfect comes with a cost, and eventually, someone always forgets a line. Ben hadn't needed to know the details. He didn't ask what was in the envelope or why it mattered or who it would hurt, but when I saw his name appear on my screen again later that day, I could tell by the tone of his text that he'd put two and two together in the way only someone with enough distance can do, someone who hadn't grown up immersed in the sticky layers of passive-aggressive manipulation and generational favoritism, but who had seen it from the outside during one awkward Thanksgiving or a church potluck, had seen the way Mom lit up when Emily walked in the room, had seen the way I became quiet when she did, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew no one would be listening. "Let me know if you want company tonight," his message read, simple and unassuming, but laced with an understanding I wasn't sure I was ready for. I didn't answer him right away, not because I didn't appreciate the offer, but because I needed space to feel the quiet satisfaction of what had happened, needed to be alone in the echo of it, where no one was asking questions, where I could admit to myself that what I had done felt, in a way I hadn't expected, like closure. Meanwhile, over at the house, Emily had apparently moved from denial into damage control, trying to put the pieces back together before too many people noticed they were broken, which meant, inevitably, that the whisper campaign had begun. I knew exactly how it would go, because I'd seen Mom do it a dozen times when someone disappointed her. There would be murmurs of emotional distress, suggestions that Emily had been under pressure, that her marriage had been strained, that perhaps the photo was misunderstood, taken out of context, just an unfortunate angle or a lapse in judgment, because in our family, reality was always up for negotiation, and if you couldn't make the truth go away, you made it smaller. Made it blurry, It sounded like it wasn't the whole story. But this time, something had shifted, something small but unshakable. Mom hadn't come out of her room for almost a full day, not to cook, not to tidy, not even to attend her weekly prayer group, which, for her, was as close to skipping church as a nun committing petty theft. That silence was louder than any accusation I could have made, more powerful than any screaming match or dramatic exit. It was the sound of her realizing that the story she'd written of Emily as the chosen daughter, the shining light, the extension of her own virtue, was no longer airtight. And yet, even as I tried to convince myself that this moment, this crack in their world, was enough, I couldn't quite shake the question clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Did I do it because I wanted her to finally see Emily clearly? Or did I do it because I wanted her to finally see me? The truth is, I didn't plant that photo out of cruelty. I didn't want to ruin Emily's life, or blow up her marriage, or shatter my mother's carefully constructed fantasy. I did it because for the first time in years, I wanted to disrupt the rhythm of our family silence. I wanted to see what happened when the secret everyone was dancing around was placed right in the middle of the room and no one could pretend it wasn't there. I wanted to test what would happen if, just once, the scales tilted toward honesty, even if only for a moment. Later that evening, as the light turned gold and the cicadas started their slow buzz across the trees outside the Airbnb, I decided to drive to the park again, not because I expected anything to be different, but because the ritual of it felt grounding, like a thread connecting the present to the past in a way that made it easier to breathe. I parked the car, walked the short loop, and sat on the same bench where I had watched that young family struggle through snack negotiations the day before. But this time, I wasn't alone. I saw her coming from across the field, hair pulled back, arms crossed tight over her chest like a shield she didn't know how to use properly, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd keep walking, maybe she'd just pass by and pretend we didn't see each other. The way we always used to do when a fight had gone too far, and there were no apologies left that didn't taste like ash. But she didn't. She walked straight toward me, heels crunching on the gravel path, and when she stopped in front of me, there was no accusation in her face, just confusion. Just the open wound of someone who thought they had the script memorized, but suddenly found themselves in a different scene. "Why would you do this to me?" she asked, voice tight, not quite angry, not quite broken, just stunned. "You're my sister." I didn't answer right away, because I wanted to get it right, because for once I didn't want to soften it, didn't want to make it more palatable. I wanted her to hear it all. "I didn't do it to you," I said finally, voice even. "I did it for Mom. So she'd finally see who she's been protecting. And who she's been ignoring." Emily blinked, like she hadn't expected that, like the idea that she wasn't the only victim here hadn't even occurred to her, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, not guilt exactly, but the uncomfortable recognition that maybe the pedestal she'd been placed on had always been a cage too, just with better lighting. She didn't say anything else. She just sat down on the other end of the bench, and we stayed like that for a while, not talking, not reconciling, just sitting in the heavy space where the truth finally got to breathe. And maybe, for now, that was enough. There is a particular weight that settles over you once the dust of a long-buried truth begins to clear, an invisible heaviness that doesn't lift with vindication or apology or even confrontation, because the weight isn't really about guilt or victory, but about the years that preceded it, the years you spent bending yourself into someone tolerable, someone less reactive, someone more forgivable in the eyes of people who couldn't see you clearly even when you were standing right in front of them, begging to be known. That's the kind of weight I felt as I drove away from the park that evening, the sky bleeding into soft blues and muted pinks behind me, and Emily's presence still lingering in the air like smoke after a quiet fire, nothing explosive, nothing cinematic. Just the faint burn of something that used to be solid finally collapsing in silence. I didn't feel triumphant, not in any real way, because the kind of satisfaction I'd always imagined I'd get from exposing Emily's carefully curated illusion turned out to be smaller than I'd expected. Less of a triumphant crescendo and more of a soft exhale after holding your breath for too long. She didn't scream. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to pretend it wasn't true. And maybe that's what haunted me the most, how little resistance there was, how easily she surrendered to the fact that I had finally, after decades of being the one who was too dramatic, too combative, too emotional, managed to create a crack in the narrative that she couldn't patch over with one of her charming smiles or church-approved explanations. When I got back to the Airbnb, the house was dim, the air still carrying the faint scent of lavender from the plug-in diffuser I'd unplugged hours earlier in a fit of irritation, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of lukewarm white wine. Not because I wanted to celebrate, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I stared at my phone, at the long string of missed calls and unanswered messages, and for a moment I considered deleting them all, clearing the slate, erasing the evidence, but I didn't. Because those messages, in their frantic, chaotic desperation, were proof that for once, they needed me, that the center of the storm wasn't just Emily and her carefully packaged mistakes, but me and the silence I had weaponized with surgical precision. Around 9 that night, after the sun had long since disappeared and the world had gone quiet in the way only small towns can manage, I got a text from Dad, not a call, not a voicemail, just a text, his first in months, and the message was short. Almost absurd in its simplicity. "Your mom isn't talking to anyone. She's not eating. Maybe come by before you go." That was it. No context. No explanation. No indication that he had any real understanding of what had happened, only the vague, helpless concern of a man who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, only to realize too late that his silence had been complicity in a house where only one story ever mattered. I stared at the message for a long time, rereading it as if it might transform into something deeper, something more direct, something that acknowledged the years of emotional neglect that had led to this moment, but it didn't. It never would. Because in my father's world, Discomfort was to be managed, not addressed, and confrontation was a dirty word reserved for other people's families, families that weren't built on politeness and denial and forced laughter at Sunday dinners. Still, I went. Not because I owed them anything, but because part of me needed to see how it all landed, how the photo, the drawer, the broken image of Emily had truly registered in a house where image had always come before substance. I parked in the driveway just before 10, the porch light still on as if expecting a visitor who hadn't RSVP'd, and let myself in with the key that had never been taken off my ring, even after all these years of not really belonging. The house was quiet, unnaturally so, and Dad was in his recliner, eyes fixed on the muted television like it might offer him a script for what to say if I spoke first. He didn't. I didn't either. I just walked past him, through the kitchen, where the leftover pie from Sunday still sat under plastic wrap on the counter, untouched, uneaten, like a symbol of everything we pretended was sweet and shared, but really just sat there growing stale in silence. Mom's door was closed, the hallway dim, the carpet still familiar under my feet in that way that made me feel 13 again, awkward, too tall, too opinionated, too much for this house, and for a long moment I stood there, not knocking, not moving, just listening for signs of life behind the door that had once been the center of the universe, the source of all approval, all affection, all conditional warmth. Eventually, I slipped a note under the door. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I didn't need to. The note wasn't long, wasn't poetic, wasn't even particularly kind, but it was honest in a way that nothing else in that house had ever been. It said, "You wanted me to be more like her. Maybe now you'll ask why she is the way she is." I left it at that. No signature. No elaboration. Just the sentence I'd been carrying for 30 years, finally delivered into the hands that had written the script of our family in permanent marker and expected the rest of us to smile through the edits. On my way out, I passed the kitchen again, and without thinking, I unwrapped the pie, took a slice, grabbed a fork from the drawer, and sat down at the table alone in silence, eating that cloyingly sweet dessert with a kind of defiance I hadn't realized I was still capable of, because sometimes revenge doesn't come in loud explosions or dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet claiming of something you were always supposed to politely decline. As I finished the last bite, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. The anger had been useful, had pushed me forward, had kept me from folding myself into a version of daughterhood that would have won applause, but stolen my sense of self. But now, in the aftermath, what I felt wasn't rage or victory or even relief. What I felt was freedom. Not the fireworks kind, not the movie-ending kind, but the slow, quiet kind that creeps in when you stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself instead. I left the fork in the sink, wiped my hands on a napkin, and walked out without saying goodbye. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to explain. The drawer had spoken. The pedestal had cracked. And I had finally stepped out of the story that had never really been mine to begin with. Some families unravel in screams, in slammed doors, in broken plates and accusations shouted through tears. But mine? Ours? We unraveled in whispers, in glances, in carefully timed silences, and one final piece of pie eaten in a kitchen no one dared to enter. And maybe that's all the justice I was ever going to get. Maybe that's all I ever needed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning of something far more honest.